Good morning, folks. Thank you all for dropping in again. My name's Joe Long, the curator of education here. And this morning we're continuing our Heroes on Zoom series based on Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge's book, American Hero Tales. And we've moved into the American Revolution era. Today's subject is going to be George Rogers Clark. And if you've been reading along, this is actually the third chapter of the book, George Rogers Clark and the Conquest of the Northwest. So let's look at a reconstruction of what Clark is said to have looked like. George Rogers Clark. Not a well-remembered name compared to some other figures of the American Revolution, and yet his effects on our history were enormous. George Rogers Clark was a frontier commander at a time and in a place where a couple hundred men could make an enormous difference. Involving the control of thousands and thousands of square miles of valuable territory. In fact, the control of a big chunk of the North American continent. And that's why the title that Lodge, welcome aboard, our new person. That's why the title that Lodge and Roosevelt chose for this little summary is George Rogers Clark and the Conquest of the Northwest. Now, to set the scene for you a little bit here, he also quotes a Walt Whitman poem and the integration of a little poetry or a song at the beginning of each of these little vignettes written was very deliberate. And Whitman's famous "O Pioneers" is the one chosen this time around. All the past we leave behind, we do debouch upon a newer, mightier world, varied world, fresh and strong, the world we seize, world of labor and the march, pioneers, oh pioneers. We detachments, steady, throwing down the edges, through the passes, up the mountain steep, conquering, holding, daring, venturing as we go the unknown ways, pioneers, oh pioneers. Well, Clark is indeed a man of the frontier. And the United States begins as simply those 13 original colonies along the seaboard. Last time we heard about Daniel Boone moving west of those colonies into Kentucky. But the Northwest, what was then called the Northwest, up toward the Great Lakes, rich and rugged territory, this area is going to be seized during the American Revolution by the actions of a very small force acting in a daring fashion. The man to whom this conquest was due, reading directly, was a famous backwoods leader, a mighty hunter, a noted Indian fighter, George Rogers Clark. He was a very strong man with light hair and blue eyes, of a good Virginia family. Early in his life, he embarked on the adventurous career of a backwoods surveyor, exactly as Washington. He traveled out to Kentucky. Soon after, it was founded by Boone and lived there for a year, either at the stations or camping by himself in the woods, surveying, hunting, and making war against the Indians like any other settler. But all the time, his mind was bent on vaster schemes that were dreamed of by men around him. And to Roosevelt and Lodge, that is one of the critical things they want to bring out in George Rogers Clark's character. The vision to see what one man with a small, dedicated force and a bit of shrewdness can attain for the new country. So Clark goes to the governor of Virginia, at that time the famous Patrick Henry, and sells his idea that with a small force of backwoodsmen, he can conquer the Northwest for the new United States. He gets authority to do that and raises 150 riflemen for the task and starts down the Ohio River in flatboats. Now, I've borrowed these images from a couple of parks which teach about Clark, and I borrowed this wonderful map from the National Park Service. I hope you can see clearly here what's going on as he takes off from, let me get my larger map here, from Pennsylvania and down following the river here on flatboats. This is quite a task. And you'll see here the names of the various American Indian nations that control the different pieces of territory here. And each of those American Indian nations is aware there are several players in the big game for the continent, that the British have come down and established forts. And that fort where you see the little explosion going on, Fort Vincennes, or Fort Sackville at Vincennes, that is going to be the one that is crucial to the whole adventure. And the British are reinforcing it. The American Indians also are aware of the new force on the continent, the United States, which is kind of the upstart group. And with the first group of Europeans who made contact with them, and in many ways that they feel the friendliest toward, the French. And the French have settlements through this area as well. Into this, George Rogers Clark heads, drifting and rowing downstream to the falls of the Ohio, where Clark founded a log hamlet which has since become the great city of Louisville. Just in passing there, he starts the city of Louisville. Here he halted for some days. He got 50 or 60 new volunteers, but a group of his original volunteers left. His force still about 160 men when he takes off. All, however, and I'm quoting here, were men on whom he could depend, men well used to frontier warfare. They were tall, stalwart backwoodsmen, clad in the hunting shirt and leggings that formed the national dress of their kind, and armed with the distinctive weapon of the backwoods, the long-barreled small-bore rifle. I have donned my hunting shirt for this occasion. These are terribly practical and comfortable garments used throughout the 19th century. Even one unit in 1860 of South Carolinians showed up with a hunting shirt as their garb, kept together by a sash into which we have an antler-handled knife as well as the ever-present tomahawk. We talked about the Kentucky rifle last time around and the importance of marksmanship on the frontier and how that turned into a big asset during conflicts, if it was used correctly. The rifleman, the American frontiersman of the 1700s, was at his most dangerous when he's at long range with a steady rest for his excellent rifle, or when he's right up upon you with his hand weapons. And George Rogers Clark's expedition is going to take advantage of both of those tactical advantages. But perhaps even more important than those tactical advantages that he knows how to use so well are the endurance and perseverance and daring to head out into this uncharted wilderness at a particularly bad time of year. And Clark's decisive leadership and his diplomacy skills, both with the American Indian tribes and also with the French. Although the British control the area, some of the settlements are predominantly French or Creole in their population. And in a moment that, as far as I'm aware of, has never been made into a movie, boy, it really ought to be, as they approach a small, but at that time important, Illinois town, Kaskaskia. Before reaching the Mississippi, the little flotilla landed, and Clark led his men northward. In Kaskaskia dwelt the British commander of the entire district up to Detroit, the small garrison, and the Creole militia, that is, the Frenchmen, outnumbered Clark's force, and they were in close alliance with the Indians round about. So he's really an upstart here with roughly 150, 160 men. Even his European origin enemies outnumber him, but the American Indians in the region vastly outnumber him. Clark was anxious to take the town by surprise and avoid bloodshed, and believed he could win over the Creoles to the American side. After all, France is becoming an ally of the United States in the war for independence. Marching cautiously by night and generally hiding by day, he came to the outskirts of the little village on the evening of July 4th and lay in the woods nearby until after nightfall. Fortune favored him. That evening, the officers of the garrison had given a great ball to the mirth-loving Creoles. Hey, who doesn't love mirth? And almost the entire population had gathered where the dance was held. While the revelry was at its height, Clark and his tall backwoodsman, treading silently through the darkness, came into the town, surprised the sentries, surrounded the fort without causing any alarm. All the British and French capable of bearing arms were gathered in the fort to take part in or look on at the merrymaking. While his men were posted, Clark walked boldly forward through the open door and, leaning against the wall, looked at the dancers as they whirled about in the light of the flaring torches. For some moments, no one noticed him. Then an Indian who had been lying with his chin on his hand, a wallflower, I suppose, looked carefully over the gaunt figure of the stranger, sprang to his feet, and uttered the wild war whoop. Immediately, the dancing ceased, and the men ran to and fro in confusion, but Clark, stepping forward, bade them be at their ease, but to remember that henceforth they danced under the flag of the United States, not under that of Great Britain. What a dramatic little episode, and how well told by the authors of hero tales. But Clark, simply by being there at the right moment with a significant but not large force and acting boldly, he has seized a major advantage, captured territory, and demonstrated to the American Indians the capacity of these upstart Americans to actually be a major challenge to the British and French, who are already established powers in the region. So he's captured that significant place, and this is when you see that red line trending downwards there. This red line trending down as the British Lieutenant Governor Hamilton moves men in. Now that Clark is over here, he's going to reinforce this fort and make sure, though he doesn't think these upstart Americans are a real threat, he's going to make sure that that fort is secure. Meanwhile, Clark is going to choose to make a march not on the schedule that Hamilton supposes, but during the winter, so that he can once again strike by surprise. In fact, Hamilton has actually dismissed a lot of his forces because the season is no longer the right season for campaigning. He thinks he's safe until the spring. If Clark, in turn, had awaited the blow, he would surely have met defeat. But he was a greater man than his antagonist. He did what the other deemed impossible. Finding that Hamilton had sent home some of his troops and dispersed all of his Indians, Clark realized his chance was to strike before Hamilton's soldiers assembled again in the spring. Accordingly, he gathered together the pick of his men, together with a few Creoles. Some of the French have come over to his side. 170 all told, and set out. At first, the journey was easy enough across the snowy Illinois prairie. They killed elk, buffalo, and deer for food. At night, they built huge fires by which to sleep. But when, in the middle of February, they reached the drowned lands of the Wabash, where the ice had just broken up and everything was flooded, the difficulties became almost insuperable. All day long, troops waded in icy water, and at night, they could, with difficulty, find some little hillock on which to sleep. Only Clark's indomitable courage and cheerfulness kept the party in heart and enabled them to persevere. Well, this allows Clark to come upon the fort as he had hoped by surprise. And once more, he's going to pull off an American victory, this time not without bloodshed, but still with great care as to the safety of his own men and with great effectiveness, and again with diplomacy. He sends a captured hunter into the town itself ahead of time, which is a very dangerous thing to do when you're planning a surprise attack. Send somebody, not necessarily on your side, who knows that you're there, into the town, but he sent him in to warn the French, the Americans are coming, they're coming to attack the British fort, you are at no risk. And this was a gamble, but it was a gamble that paid off because the French completely stood down and watched the Americans go in and begin their siege of the fort. This siege was effective, and George Rogers Clark's men would eventually accept the fort's surrender. Another episode is also related by Roosevelt. After the fort and the town had been captured and were in American hands, a war party which had been sent behind into the American territories to cause havoc and destruction there returned to town, not realizing their allies, the British, were no longer in command. The next day, a party of Indian warriors who had been ravaging the settlements of Kentucky arrived and entered the town. Marching boldly forward to the fort, they found it beleaguered, and before they could flee, they were seized by the backwoodsmen. In their belts, they carried the scalps of the slain settlers. Now, if you can imagine, you're a frontier fighter who has just captured returning members of a war party with scalps in his belt. These scalps, as far as you know, as a frontiersman, might be from people you actually know back in Kentucky. Mercy was not granted. Of the captured, they were tomahawked, scalped themselves, and thrown into the river, an action which George Rogers Clark never apologized for and which Roosevelt and Lodge don't criticize him for either. Now, there's a sad coda to the story of George Rogers Clark, and that is that in order to do some of these things during the American Revolution, Clark actually spent his own money to buy supplies for his men, putting himself in debt that the country did not pay him back and that would plague him for the rest of his life. Nevertheless, he would go down as one of the great commanders in our history. Now, wrapping up, and I have failed at my 15-minute goal again, but I hope you don't mind. We talk about each time what are the lessons that Roosevelt and Lodge are trying to show us from the story they tell of a particular hero. And we learned about Washington as a great commander and a responsible user of power and authority. Then we looked at Daniel Boone and the virtues of a brave man on the frontier. Now we're sort of putting them together. The virtues of the commander and the frontiersman are displayed by George Rogers Clark. That phrase that he had vaster schemes than those about him when he was in Boonesboro. This is part of what made him who he was and what Roosevelt thought Americans ought to have, a vision for great achievement, a thing to accomplish in mind, even if it's an unlikely and difficult thing. Clark is really Roosevelt's man in the arena. Initiative. He bugs Patrick Henry. He gets permission. He recruits his own men. He spends his own money, and he attempts something never done before. Not waiting for somebody else to take the Northwest. He's going to do it himself. Diplomacy. This man was an amazing diplomat with just the right mix of carrot and stick to manage relations both with the Native American tribes he encountered and with the Creole settlers in the area, as well as even with the Catholic Church. And there is a side story here of a patriot priest among the French who was a strong contributor to his efforts. Of course, he's a good warrior, tactical prowess. He's good at battle. When he gets in a fight, he wins it. And we'll return to that theme during the American Hero Tales. And as always with Roosevelt and Lodge, they emphasize his character built by challenge. He lives the life of the backwoodsman, and then he undertakes some really difficult tasks involving pushing the endurance of himself and his men to the limit. So as always, the difficulties that he encounters are what Roosevelt and Lodge see as shaping his character and setting the example for the rest of us. Now, I've run a couple of minutes over time. But if anybody has a question now, I'll be happy to go ahead and take any of those questions to the best of my ability. And next Tuesday, we will return with some more American Revolution and more lessons from Hero Tales by Roosevelt. So any questions at this point? Well, we do appreciate it. Our first episode on George Washington is now up on YouTube. That would be a great thing to share with your friends so we can get a few more folks to check in with us for the rest of this series. And I hope that you all have a terrific day. Oh, I see one question.